So we already knew active numbers. We already knew what the total transaction values were from the results, the quarterlies. But the real surprise in there came around the losses and around the gross losses, which is the customer losses. So I think from our standpoint, it's surprising to see, the extent of losses. They're having to spend on marketing already, and this is before you start to see some competitors like Apple come into the space, PayPal going more aggressively. But I think what's important in these names is, if anything, we've seen is the acceleration of what would have been industry consolidation being brought forward. So when we think about the big players, such as an Afterpay and a Zip, these are global guys, and a lot of the payment players like your Square want to move into that space. So I think this probably is the beginning rather than the end of industry consolidation as a starting point. And something that was positive in the result was around that merchant service fee, which is the take rate for these guys, what the merchants pay them. If there is intense competition, generally you'd expect that to go to the floor as everyone's just fighting for an incremental customer. So I think because that was better than what we all expected, if anything, perhaps the suggestion that, they're still gaining market share. They don't have to drop down the prices yet. They're just in that phase of having to reinvest because you have to cement your market position now, whilst you've still got that long runway, and then go from there in the future.
Elise, do you have any hesitation around Zip rebranding QuadPay in the US? Because that's come up in a number of reports that I've read. They bought this business, it's established, it's known in the US. They paid big for it because of its established position and its brand, and then they're changing it.
I think I can see the strategy around why you do want a unified brand. You think how many global brands there are, and also the opportunity and difference with this is if you're in Australia and you want to buy from the US or you want to buy from Europe in the future, Zip's going to be able to have a platform that does that. So you think about integrating that as a whole, which is the strategic rationale, and that makes sense. Sure, it's hard to overcome the education process in rebranding, but I think, if done right, we have seen brands be able to go through that. So yeah, perhaps initially in the first year that might be a challenge, but if they are going to achieve their overarching strategy, then it's probably a necessary small incremental step backwards to go 2 steps forward.
And then we get to Afterpay. So Afterpay, it's all about Square now, but we chatted with Anthony Eisen, the CEO, on the day of the results, and he was really talking about this whole ecosystem, so there being no barrier between payments and commerce and finance. So is that where Afterpay is headed, to be an institution, financial institution for a different generation than myself? And do you endorse that?
Absolutely. I think it's not necessarily thinking that it's trying to be a neobank, but definitely intertwining and diversifying away from just being buy now, pay later. And again, that's a really important step for a stock like this, is because it removes some of that overhang and regulatory risk. If you think, for example, moving into that marketplace, so they're charging advertising and click-through revenue, which isn't as regulated as it doesn't need to be versus, giving small loans. So the more that they move into building that ecosystem, it removes some of that overhang that has been on the stock, and it also, though, leverages the customers that exist today, gets more out of them. They're using their brand again to be able to monetize existing customers. That overall, yeah, I think that's one, the way of the future, and two, a very good strategy.